Blake Lively was not expecting to be this month's cover model for The Hollywood Reporter, and she's put out an official statement calling them sexist. A rep for Blake Lively said The Hollywood Reporter should be ashamed of themselves, saying the framing in this picture is outrageously insulting as it plays in every sexist trope about women who dare to file a workplace complaint.
You won't believe what's happening behind closed doors with Blake Lively. What was supposed to be a legal battle about workplace misconduct is quickly turning into a full-blown crisis for the actress. From accusations of manipulation to evidence of a carefully crafted narrative falling apart, it's clear that something much bigger is at play here. Keep watching as we uncover the truth behind Blake Lively's shocking downfall. Blake Lively's entire public image was shattered after The Hollywood Reporter dropped a brutal expose that no one saw coming. What was supposed to be a simple magazine feature showcasing Blake's latest projects and contributions quickly turned into a devastating takedown of her personal and professional life. The magazine published an illustration of Blake launching a slingshot aimed at Justin Baldoni, an image that mocked her legal dispute and made her look completely ridiculous. While the artwork might have seemed innocent on the surface, its impact was far-reaching. Rather than letting it slide, Blake's team reacted aggressively, labeling the cover as sexist and accusing the magazine of perpetuating harmful stereotypes about women who speak out. But here's the catch. Blake's response only deepened her public relations nightmare. What should have been a simple, measured response turned into a chaotic attempt to divert attention from the real issues. This backfired spectacularly, showing the public just how fragile her image really was. Instead of rallying support, the internet turned on her, pointing out the hypocrisy of her reaction. Blake's public persona is one that champions empowerment, grace, and resilience. Yet here she was, unable to handle a satirical cartoon. This entire situation only highlighted the cracks in her carefully crafted image. Her inability to rise above the criticism made her look weak, and it seemed like her PR team was playing defense rather than addressing the underlying issues that the article had uncovered. As the fallout continued, the question on everyone's mind was, why was she reacting this way? What was she trying to hide? Rather than addressing the content of the article, Blake's team immediately fell back on the familiar tactic of playing the victim. They claimed that The Hollywood Reporter was reinforcing outdated and harmful stereotypes about women who speak out in the workplace. They argued that the cover was a reflection of the sexism women face when they try to expose misconduct. This was the classic victimhood defense, something that might have garnered sympathy from a different audience. But instead of garnering public support, the victim narrative quickly backfired. People saw right through the emotional plea and began pointing out the irony. The same woman who had spent years preaching strength, resilience, and standing up for what's right was now crying over a cartoon. The juxtaposition was jarring. How could the same person who regularly spoke out on social issues now fail to handle this relatively minor issue with grace? What followed was even worse for Blake's reputation. Instead of using the moment to address the real problem, the allegations against Baldoni, Blake's team chose to stoke outrage. They hoped for a viral social media reaction, but what they got instead was mockery. People didn't feel sorry for her. They mocked her for taking the bait. This wasn't about standing up for a cause, this was about deflecting attention from a much bigger issue, one that Blake was clearly unprepared to handle. The reaction on social media quickly morphed from sympathy to skepticism. The internet began questioning Blake's motives and, more importantly, the credibility of her legal claims. It became painfully obvious that her response was not about justice, it was about controlling the narrative. And, in the end, it was an attempt that failed miserably. The Hollywood Reporter article didn't just mock Blake's reaction, it delivered a game-changing revelation that shifted the entire narrative surrounding the lawsuit. In the feature, the magazine delved into Justin Baldoni's Baha'i faith, suggesting that what was initially framed as misconduct could have been a massive cultural misunderstanding. This was a pivotal moment in the story. Instead of addressing this critical piece of information, Blake's legal team chose to double down on their original accusations. They ignored the possibility that cultural differences, particularly the warmth and expressiveness often associated with the Baha'i faith, might have been misinterpreted. Instead of reassessing their approach, they dug in their heels and continued to portray the situation as one of clear misconduct, failing to acknowledge the nuance involved. This lack of acknowledgement became a turning point for many in the public. What had once seemed like a straightforward case of harassment now appeared to be much more complicated. Could it be that the allegations were blown out of proportion? Could cultural differences have been the root cause of the conflict? These questions became more pressing as the narrative evolved, and the public began to see the case in a new light. Unfortunately for Blake, her refusal to engage with these nuances made her legal case look even more fragile. Instead of adapting to the changing landscape, she stuck rigidly to her victim narrative, which only exposed how limited her understanding of the situation truly was. The more she refused to evolve, the more the cracks in her story began to show. Blake's legal strategy took a shocking turn when it was revealed that key text messages had mysteriously disappeared from her amended lawsuit. The deleted texts could have provided crucial context, or perhaps even undermined her entire case. Legal experts were quick to point out that this wasn't a simple oversight. It was a calculated effort to sanitize her story, to remove any evidence that could weaken her claims. This move was particularly damaging because it suggested that Blake's team wasn't interested in presenting the full truth. They were interested in controlling the narrative. The missing text messages weren't just irrelevant details, they were potential pieces of evidence that could have changed the course of the entire legal battle. By deleting them, Blake's team not only made themselves look dishonest, but also cast serious doubt on the credibility of the entire lawsuit. The public took notice. What was once seen as a strong legal case began to unravel piece by piece. The media and legal experts started questioning whether Blake's case had ever been as solid as she had claimed. Was this really a case of harassment, or was it a carefully constructed narrative built on misinterpretation? The more inconsistencies surfaced, the more people began to believe that Blake's legal battle was less about seeking justice and more about keeping up appearances. Blake's legal troubles were no longer just about the accusations against Baldoni, they had morphed into a much larger issue. Could Blake's actions in this case be considered a strategic move to manipulate public perception? As each new detail emerged, it seemed increasingly likely that the truth had been distorted to fit a narrative that no longer seemed to hold up. While Blake's team struggled to keep their story intact, Justin Baldoni's defense team remained focused and determined, countering every one of her accusations with hard evidence. Instead of relying on vague claims and emotional appeals, Baldoni's team presented clear, verifiable facts that completely contradicted Blake's narrative. From text messages to phone calls and emails, Baldoni's side had receipts that made it clear that his actions were entirely professional and appropriate. This stark contrast only highlighted the weaknesses in Blake's case. While she was busy spinning her narrative, Baldoni's team was methodically dismantling each of her accusations with irrefutable evidence. The more evidence Baldoni's team produced, the weaker Blake's case appeared. The public and media couldn't ignore the growing disparity between the two sides. Baldoni's team didn't just defend his actions, they worked to expose the broader issue at play. They pointed out that the allegations against him weren't a case of misconduct. They were the result of a misunderstanding, one that was heavily influenced by cultural differences. By focusing on facts and context, Baldoni's team shifted the conversation from a battle of accusations to a discussion about cultural interpretation. In stark contrast, Blake's team continued to rely on vague and emotional accusations, hoping that the public would take their word for it. Unfortunately for Blake, this strategy wasn't working anymore. The truth was beginning to come out, and it was clear that the evidence was on Baldoni's side, not hers. As the details of Blake's case continued to unravel, social media, which had once been a safe haven for her, began to turn against her. Initially, Blake had enjoyed widespread support, but as more facts came to light, the tide began to shift. What had been a serious legal battle was now being reduced to an online spectacle, filled with memes, sarcastic posts, and relentless commentary mocking her. The irony wasn't lost on the internet. Blake Lively, who had spent years building an image of empowerment and strength, was now being ridiculed for not being able to handle a satirical cartoon. The very people who had once praised her for speaking out about important issues were now questioning her credibility. It seemed like every attempt to control the narrative only made things worse. Instead of staying focused on the legal battle, Blake became the subject of online mockery. People questioned the sincerity of her claims and began to view her legal actions as nothing more than a desperate attempt to salvage her reputation. The more Blake tried to spin the situation in her favor, the more the public saw through the facade. The backlash on social media wasn't just about the case, it was about Blake's entire approach to the situation. She had tried to use her platform to advance a narrative, but now it was backfiring. The internet wasn't just questioning her claims, it was mocking them, and at this point, there was no turning back. With her case falling apart and public opinion shifting against her, Blake's legal team made a last-ditch effort to regain control. They amended the lawsuit to include vague defamation claims against other women, supposedly accusing Baldoni of making them feel uncomfortable. But here's the catch. There were no details, no names, and no evidence to back up these new claims. It was a move so transparently desperate that it only confirmed what many had already suspected. This wasn't about seeking justice, it was about damage control. The inclusion of these vague defamation claims raised serious doubts about Blake's intentions. Why would she add accusations that weren't backed by any real evidence? Was this an attempt to bolster her case, Or was it simply an effort to distract from the mounting inconsistencies? The move backfired spectacularly, making it even harder for the public to take her seriously. Instead of strengthening her case, these new claims exposed just how much Blake's legal strategy was crumbling. It became clear that Blake wasn't interested in finding the truth. She was focused solely on controlling the story, even if that meant resorting to desperate measures. Her failure to present solid evidence and instead relying on vague defamation claims only made her case look weaker and weaker. At this point, it was hard to deny that Blake's legal battle wasn't about justice, it was about control. And with every new move, it seemed like the more she tried to control the situation, the more it slipped out of her hands. As the legal drama unfolded, new reports began to suggest that Blake's role on It Ends With Us wasn't as passive as she had led people to believe. According to sources, Blake was running the production with an iron grip, dictating not just the script and filming process, but also making creative decisions and bending the entire project to her will. Instead of allowing for a collaborative effort, she used her star power to micromanage every detail. What was supposed to be a team effort turned into Blake's personal project, one that reflected her desire for control. In a way, it became a masterclass in micromanagement, with Blake using her influence to dominate the set. This didn't align with the narrative her legal team was trying to build, which painted her as simply trying to ensure a safe and comfortable environment for all involved. Reports suggested that Blake's attempts to frame her actions as a concern for safety were nothing more than a cover-up for her overreaching control. The production of It Ends With Us had become less about collaboration and more about Blake's personal agenda. She dictated the terms and made sure everything aligned with her vision, even if it meant stepping on others along the way. This revelation was a game changer. Instead of being seen as a victim of harassment, Blake's behavior on set began to be seen as the real issue. Her attempts to control everything on set, coupled with her legal team's desperate attempts to rewrite history, painted a very different picture. Now, instead of fighting for justice, she seemed more concerned with maintaining control over the narrative and the project. One of Blake's most damaging claims centers around a slow dance scene in It Ends With Us, where she accused Justin Baldoni of adding unapproved gestures that made her uncomfortable. She claimed that these actions were inappropriate and crossed boundaries. But video footage from the set tells a completely different story. In the footage, Blake is seen fully engaged in the scene, even initiating some of the gestures that she later claimed were unwanted. This contradicted her narrative of non-consent and raised serious doubts about her version of events. Instead of being a victim of unwanted behavior, Blake seemed to have been an active participant in the scene, which made her claims seem less credible. Baldoni's team maintained that the scene was always intended to depict mutual attraction and intimacy, not misconduct. They argued that the gestures Blake claimed were inappropriate were, in fact, part of a planned and approved scene that reflected the chemistry between the two characters. The footage only confirmed their defense, further discrediting Blake's allegations. This contradiction was devastating for Blake's case. Not only did it undermine her claims about non-consent, but it also revealed a disturbing pattern of selective editing on her part. Instead of acknowledging the reality of the situation, Blake chose to twist the facts to fit her narrative, but the truth was becoming harder to hide. As Blake Lively's case continued to unravel, it became painfully clear that her legal strategy was built on shaky ground. Instead of presenting solid evidence to support her claims, she relied on selective edits, vague allegations, and fabricated details to strengthen her case. But with each passing day, her carefully crafted narrative began to fall apart. Legal experts began pointing out the inconsistencies and contradictions in her story, calling her out for attempting to manipulate public perception. Blake had once been seen as a strong, empowered woman fighting for justice, but now she was being exposed as someone who was willing to twist the facts and rewrite history to suit her needs. As the revelations continued to pile up, it seemed more and more likely that Blake's entire case was based on a fabricated narrative designed to maintain control over the public conversation. The truth was catching up to her, and with each new revelation, her credibility was eroding. Blake's desperate attempts to rewrite reality were only making things worse. Instead of standing firm with solid evidence and a clear narrative, she was relying on emotional appeals and manipulation. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was about desperation. And with every move she made, the truth became harder to ignore.